Welcome back to the Alibi Club, where every mystery is a case file waiting to be reopened. Small towns often hide big secrets, but few have ever produced a tale as chilling as the one that emerged from Enfield, Illinois, in the spring of 1973. It began with the frightened testimony of a local man who claimed he had seen something outside his home, something unlike any animal he had ever encountered. The creature was described as having 3 legs, glowing red eyes, and a body that seemed to lurch rather than walk. Neighbors soon added their own accounts, speaking of strange sounds, claw marks, and a presence that left their community in fear. Some dismissed it as mass hysteria, others as exaggeration. Yet for those who lived through it, the Enfield Horror was real, a nightmare that stalked their quiet streets and refused to fit into any known description. Enfield, Illinois, in the early 1970s, was the kind of place most people would overlook on a map. It was small, quiet, and rural, an American community, where everyone knew their neighbors, where doors were often left unlocked, and where nightly routines rarely changed. Families gathered in living rooms, radios hummed with local news, and children played in backyards until dusk. Life in Enfield moved slowly, with little reason for outside attention. That was, until the night of April 25, 1973, when a local resident by the name of Henry McDaniel came home and found that his quiet life was about to be shattered. McDaniel, a straightforward man known by his neighbors as reliable, lived with his wife and 2 children in a modest home on the edge of town. The day had been ordinary, and by nightfall he was settling into the rhythms of his household. But then, he and his family began to hear noises, scratching, thumping, something moving outside near the porch. At first, McDaniel thought it might be a stray animal. After all, rural Illinois had its fair share of raccoons, stray dogs, or even wandering livestock. But the sound was persistent, heavier than he expected, almost deliberate. When McDaniel stepped outside to investigate, he found himself staring at something that defied not only explanation but belief. There, in the dim light near his front porch, crouched a creature unlike anything he had ever seen. He later described it in vivid, almost reluctant detail. It stood about 4.5 feet tall, with short, greyish, almost leathery skin. Its eyes glowed a deep, unsettling red in the dark. Most shocking of all, it seemed to balance on 3 legs, 2 in front and 1 in the back, giving it a lopsided, unnatural gait. McDaniel froze. His first instinct was that his mind was playing tricks on him, but the longer he stared, the more the creature's strange features burned into his memory. It had small, claw-like arms protruding from its sides, and its movements were jerky, not fluid like a normal animal. The sound it made was just as haunting, a hiss that echoed with a quality he couldn't compare to anything he'd ever heard before. As the realization set in that this was no stray dog, fear surged. McDaniel rushed back inside, grabbed his revolver, and returned to the porch with the weapon drawn. The creature still lingered, staring at him with those glowing red eyes. Summoning his courage, McDaniel fired 4 shots. He was certain he hit it. He could hear the bullets make contact, but instead of collapsing, the creature let out a high-pitched screech and bounded away into the night, covering a distance of nearly 50 feet in just 3 leaps. McDaniel stood there, stunned. He knew what he had seen, but he also knew no one would believe him. Still, he could not ignore what had just happened. He went back inside, locked the doors, and told his family to stay away from the windows. His children were terrified, and his wife urged him not to tell anyone. But McDaniel was not the type to keep such a thing quiet. The next day he reported the incident to the local police. To his surprise, they took him seriously enough to investigate. Officers came to his property and inspected the area. What they found shocked them. Deep scratches on the siding of his home, as if something with claws had tried to tear its way inside. They also discovered strange 3-toed tracks in the soft ground near the porch, prints that did not resemble any known animal. Each track was roughly 6 inches across, with a long, almost heel-like impression extending behind. The officers admitted privately that they could not explain them. Word spread quickly through Enfield. A quiet town had suddenly become the setting for something terrifying. Neighbors began to whisper. Children were warned not to stay out after dark, and some residents claimed they too had seen or heard something unusual in the nights that followed. For a community unaccustomed to sensational stories, the Enfield Horror was as unsettling as it was unbelievable. McDaniel, for his part, stood by his account. He didn't waver when questioned, didn't embellish the details, and seemed almost reluctant to talk about it beyond what he had already said. He was a man who had nothing to gain from inventing such a story, and yet he couldn't shake the memory of the glowing red eyes staring at him from his porch. The incident marked the beginning of a wave of sightings and reports that would put Enfield on the map for reasons its residents never expected. A creature had been seen, one that defied ordinary description, and whether it was an animal, a hoax, or something far stranger, the town of Enfield would never be quite the same again. When Henry McDaniel reported his encounter to local authorities, he wasn't just relaying a strange story, he was putting his reputation on the line. In a small town like Enfield, a man's word mattered. People knew him as practical, level-headed, and not one to chase wild tales. That's why his testimony carried weight, even when it sounded unbelievable. McDaniel described the events with calm precision. He told officers how the scratching outside his home first drew his attention, how he thought it might be a stray dog until he saw the creature in the dim light, and how its red eyes and unnatural gait convinced him it was something far stranger. He spoke of its 3 legs, 2 forward, 1 behind, and how it leapt enormous distances when he fired his revolver at it. He was adamant he had struck the creature, yet it escaped unharmed. The police examined his home carefully. The siding bore long, claw-like scratches, deep enough to suggest strength beyond that of a raccoon or stray cat. More unsettling were the tracks in the dirt near his porch. 3-toed impressions, 6 inches across, unlike anything local officers had encountered. Photographs were taken, and though they would later vanish into obscurity, those who saw them confirmed they did not match any ordinary animal. The officers, perhaps unsure of what they were dealing with, made no arrests and issued no charges. Instead, they quietly noted McDaniel's report and left it at that. But word spread through town with speed. No official report could stop. Within days, neighbors whispered of the thing Henry had seen. Parents warned children to come home before dark. What had been an isolated sighting quickly grew into a community concern. McDaniel himself refused to back down. When reporters began to visit Enfield, curious about the strange story, he told them the same thing he told the police. He wasn't looking for attention. If anything, the sudden spotlight made him uncomfortable, but he wasn't about to lie. It had 3 legs on it, a short body, 2 little arms, and 2 pink eyes as big as flashlights, he insisted to the press. It stood 4.5 feet tall, and it was greyish-coloured. It was trying to get into the house. Such a description was almost impossible to dismiss. Too detailed to be a fleeting shadow, too vivid to be a hallucination. The strangeness of it all, though, divided the town. Some believed McDaniel wholeheartedly, others whispered that he had imagined it, perhaps after too many drinks or a long night. Skeptics said he might have seen an exotic animal escaped from someone's private collection, but no one could explain the tracks. Soon, others came forward with their own accounts. Some residents claimed they heard shrieks in the night, sounds that made dogs whimper and hide. Others said they caught glimpses of a strange figure moving through the brush on the outskirts of town. The Enfield Horror, as it came to be called, was no longer just McDaniel's story, it was becoming Enfield's story. Reporters from outside Illinois began arriving, drawn by the bizarre description. They found McDaniel unshaken in his testimony. "If they don't believe me, I can't help it," he told one journalist. "But I know what I saw." His quiet certainty, delivered without flourish, only made the tale more compelling. He was not asking anyone to believe in monsters. He was simply telling them what had appeared on his porch. The sheriff, perhaps trying to contain the growing hysteria, warned residents not to go hunting for the creature themselves, but that advice fell on deaf ears. Groups of curious locals, armed with flashlights and rifles, began roaming the woods and fields at night, hoping to catch sight of the thing McDaniel had described. For them, fear mixed with excitement. If the creature was real, perhaps they could prove it. If it wasn't, then at least the story gave them something to break the monotony of small-town life. Yet despite the skepticism, the tension was real. McDaniel's testimony had planted a seed of doubt in the community. If even a small chance existed that such a creature lurked nearby, then every scratch at a window, every sound in the night, became suspect. A town that had once felt safe and ordinary, now found itself glancing over its shoulder after dark. The Enfield Horror was no longer just a description, it was a presence, one that haunted the collective imagination of a town unprepared for the strange. And McDaniel, a man who had never sought attention, was at the center of it all, caught between those who believed and those who thought he had seen too much in the shadows. As Henry McDaniel's story gained traction, the town of Enfield found itself transformed. What began as a single man's testimony quickly spiraled into a shared unease. The local paper printed accounts of the incident, and soon the whispers turned into conversations held in hushed tones at the grocery store, the school, and the diner. Parents kept their children inside after sunset. Farmers who were used to working into the late evening now packed up their tools earlier. Fear spread like a fog, invisible but impossible to ignore. The most unsettling part was that McDaniel's description did not remain isolated. Within days, neighbors began reporting their own encounters. One family claimed to hear strange scratching on their back door late at night, eerily similar to what McDaniel had described. Another resident swore he saw a grey, lurching figure moving along the roadside, its glowing red eyes reflecting in the beams of his headlights. A group of children said they had heard a cry in the night, high-pitched and unnatural, that left them too afraid to play outside after dark. It wasn't just the stories themselves that caused alarm. It was the consistency. Different people, with no reason to collude, spoke of similar features: short, stocky build, glowing eyes, jerky movements, and a shriek that set nerves on edge. Skeptics said fear was contagious, that once McDaniel described what he saw, others began to imagine the same. But believers countered that imagination alone could not leave behind claw marks or tracks in the dirt. Police patrols increased around Enfield, though officers were clearly reluctant to comment on what they were searching for. They could acknowledge that unusual tracks had been found, but beyond that, their silence only added to the tension. Meanwhile, curious locals and thrill-seekers from nearby towns arrived at night, armed with flashlights, baseball bats, and in some cases firearms. They prowled the countryside, hoping for a glimpse of the creature. Some claimed they saw fleeting movements in the shadows, though nothing was ever captured or confirmed. The Enfield Horror had become more than just a strange encounter. It was a mirror reflecting the anxieties of the time. America in the 1970s was restless. Stories of UFO sightings, cryptids, and government cover-ups filled headlines. The creature in Enfield fit neatly into that atmosphere of suspicion, feeding into the sense that the world held secrets far beyond what ordinary people could understand. And perhaps this is a good time to pause and ask you, the listener, where are you right now as you hear this? What time is it for you? Maybe you're in your bedroom, lights dimmed, or maybe you're driving through a quiet road at night. Think about that for a moment, the familiarity of your surroundings, and how quickly it could shift if you too heard scratching at your window or saw glowing red eyes staring back at you. Back in Enfield, fear gave way to obsession. Reporters arrived, and the town's quiet anonymity vanished overnight. Flashbulbs lit up porches, and journalists peppered residents with questions. McDaniel found himself repeating his story again and again, his patience thinning but his certainty never wavering. Some outsiders mocked the town as gullible, while others treated it as a genuine hotspot of the unexplained. Either way, Enfield was no longer just a small Illinois town. It was now the stage for a mystery that refused to be dismissed. If there was one detail that gave weight to Henry McDaniel's story, it was the tracks. Stories could be doubted, witnesses could be questioned, but marks left in the earth were harder to dismiss. The morning after his frightening encounter, police officers and several curious neighbors gathered outside his home to search the property. What they found was strange enough to deepen the mystery: large, three-toed impressions pressed into the damp ground. The prints were odd in every sense. Each measured about 6 inches across, with 2 toes pointing forward and a third angled slightly off to the side. They sank deep into the soft earth, as if left by something heavy. What unsettled observers most was their spacing. They weren't close together like the paw prints of a dog or the hooves of a goat. Instead, they were spread far apart, sometimes nearly 3 feet between impressions, suggesting that whatever left them moved in bounding leaps rather than steady steps. Police examined the tracks carefully, noting their unusual shape. Neighbors crouched in the mud to compare them against boots and animal prints. None of them could match it to anything they knew. One officer admitted privately that he had never seen tracks like this before. The idea of pranksters came up almost immediately. Perhaps some mischievous locals had carved shapes into planks and pressed them into the soil. But when examined closely, the edges of the impressions looked too natural, too irregular to be the result of a wooden cutout. They appeared genuine, as though real flesh and bone had pressed into the ground. The discovery spread quickly through town. Residents who had been skeptical of McDaniel's story began to reconsider. A frightened imagination could conjure glowing eyes in the night, but it could not stamp heavy, clawed tracks into wet dirt. Soon reports surfaced of similar prints near other homes. Families claimed they had heard scratching outside their windows, and when they checked the next morning, the same three-toed marks were there, trailing off into fields or disappearing suddenly at the edge of town. Some suggested the tracks belonged to a kangaroo, escaped from a traveling circus or private collection. The idea was not entirely far-fetched. Illinois had seen odd exotic animals appear on occasion, but McDaniel scoffed at the theory. He insisted the creature he had seen was no kangaroo. Its body was shorter, its skin grey and leathery, its eyes glowing red. The tracks may have reminded some of a kangaroo's hopping pattern, but the details didn't line up. More troubling was the way the tracks ended. On multiple occasions, searchers followed them into open fields, only to have them vanish, as though the creature had leapt into thin air. There were no signs of turning back, no gradual fading of the impressions. One set of tracks ran for nearly 50 yards, and then simply stopped, the last print sinking deep as though the creature had pushed off with incredible force. The absence of a landing point only deepened the unease. To those who wanted to believe McDaniel, the tracks were proof. To skeptics, they were unexplained, but not unexplainable. Maybe they were distorted impressions left by dogs, pressed deeper and oddly shaped by rain. Maybe someone in town had faked them to feed the frenzy. But even skeptics had to admit that the number of people who saw the prints firsthand made it hard to dismiss as a single prank. Too many eyes had witnessed them. The strange cries heard in the nights that followed only added to the tension. Residents described them as shrill, metallic screeches, unlike any animal native to the region. Dogs barked wildly when the noises echoed across the fields, and livestock grew restless in their pens. People spoke of lying awake in the dark, waiting for the sound, dreading that it might come closer. Each cry made the tracks feel more sinister, as though the earth itself had been marked by something not meant to be here. For the McDaniel family, the tracks were vindication. Henry could point to them as evidence that he had not imagined what he saw. "I didn't dream it," he told a reporter. "The tracks were there. They're real." His certainty carried weight, especially when paired with the claw marks on his siding, another physical reminder that something had clawed at his home. Soon, the story of the tracks drew outsiders to Enfield. Amateur investigators, cryptozoologists, and thrill-seekers began showing up at night, hoping to see the creature for themselves. Flashlights bobbed in the fields as small groups searched for fresh impressions. Some claimed they found them. Others came away convinced the whole story was a hoax. But in every retelling, the tracks became the central piece of evidence, proof that something had passed through Enfield, that April, something no one could quite identify. What made the prints so disturbing was their simplicity. They weren't blurry photographs or exaggerated tales. They were marks pressed into the soil, stubborn and undeniable, and even when they vanished, they left behind the uneasy feeling that something capable of making them could reappear at any time. As the days passed after Henry McDaniel's report, the Enfield Horror was no longer just a private terror. It had become a public obsession. The quiet routines of the small Illinois town were disrupted by late-night patrols, whispered warnings, and the hum of fear that followed people into their homes. Yet fear wasn't the only reaction. Curiosity, and a touch of recklessness, drove groups of residents and outsiders into the fields, armed and determined to find whatever had left the tracks. Local newspapers reported that on certain nights, small bands of men set out carrying rifles, shotguns, and flashlights. Some were locals who wanted to protect their families. Others were thrill-seekers from neighboring towns, drawn by the lure of a monster hunt. For them, it was an adventure, an escape from the monotony of rural life. But underneath the bravado, there was real unease. They knew McDaniel was no prankster. They had seen the tracks themselves, and in the darkness, their imaginations filled in the rest. The search parties spread across fields and wooded areas, sweeping their lights through the brush. Every rustle, every snapping twig, sent hearts racing. Dogs barked wildly at the edges of the search lines, straining at their leashes as if scenting something unnatural. Some men claimed they saw glowing eyes reflecting back at them in the dark, but when they advanced, there was nothing there. Others said they heard the piercing screech McDaniel had described, a sound so sharp it made them shudder. On one occasion, a group swore they had cornered the creature near an abandoned outbuilding. The men raised their weapons and advanced carefully, but when they burst inside, the place was empty. Only the smell of damp earth and the faint echo of something moving away remained. They followed tracks outside, three-toed impressions in the mud, but after a few yards, they ended abruptly, as though the creature had leapt away in a single bound. The men argued among themselves, some insisting they had been close, others claiming their minds had played tricks on them. Law enforcement, already wary of the hysteria, began to worry about the danger of these armed hunts. Sheriff's deputies patrolled to disperse groups, warning them against firing blindly into the night. An accident seemed inevitable. Yet, despite the warnings, the hunts continued. For many, the lure of the unknown was too strong. The idea that something strange and unearthly might be lurking in their town was frightening, but also intoxicating. The hunts attracted attention far beyond Enfield. Reporters flocked to the small town, eager to capture photographs of the men with their rifles and flashlights. Articles painted Enfield as a community on edge, its citizens caught between fear and fascination. Some accounts mocked the residents as gullible, others framed the story as a genuine mystery worth investigating. Either way, Enfield's anonymity was gone. It was now firmly in the spotlight of the bizarre. For Henry McDaniel, the situation became even more complicated. He had only wanted to report what he saw, but his words had sparked something he could not control. He gave interviews reluctantly, repeating his description with the same calm certainty. "It had 3 legs," he reminded one reporter. "It wasn't a dog or a kangaroo. It was something I'd never seen before, and it was trying to get into my house." His steadfastness frustrated skeptics, but gave believers more reason to rally behind him. The growing commotion began to attract not just locals and journalists, but also researchers from outside fields. Cryptozoologists, the amateur scientists who study unknown or hidden animals, arrived with notebooks and cameras. To them, Enfield was the site of a living mystery, perhaps even evidence of a new species. UFO enthusiasts arrived as well, speculating that the creature might not be of this world at all. They argued that the strange leaps, the glowing eyes, and the unexplained tracks hinted at something extraterrestrial. Not everyone welcomed the attention. Many longtime residents disliked the sudden crowds and the way outsiders treated their town like a circus. Some openly scoffed at McDaniel's story, arguing that he had mistaken an animal for something more sinister. A few even accused him of making it up, though such claims did not align with his consistent testimony. But whether people believed or doubted, the effect was the same. Enfield was no longer a quiet town. And still, in the nights that followed, strange sounds echoed in the darkness. Families spoke of hearing scratching at windows. Farmers swore livestock grew restless for no reason. Hunters returned with stories of fleeting glimpses and unexplained cries. Nothing conclusive was ever found, but the atmosphere was thick with unease. The armed search parties never captured the creature, but in a way they did something more lasting. They cemented the Enfield Horror as a legend. The image of men sweeping fields with rifles and flashlights became part of the story itself, a visual that reporters carried far beyond Illinois. And while skeptics dismissed it all as hysteria, those who had been there, who had followed the tracks, who had heard the cries, remained convinced that something unexplainable had passed through their town. Every strange story invites explanations, and the Enfield Horror was no different. For every frightened witness who swore they had seen or heard something unnatural, there was someone else ready to dismiss it with a shrug. Skeptics argued that Henry McDaniel's terrifying encounter was nothing more than a mix of poor lighting, nerves, and exaggeration that snowballed into hysteria. Yet the arguments they offered, while logical on the surface, never quite explained everything. The first and most common theory was misidentification. Southern Illinois was home to plenty of animals that could look unsettling at night. Dogs, coyotes, large owls, even raccoons moving strangely in the dark. McDaniel, skeptics said, may have seen an ordinary animal distorted by shadow and panic. The glowing red eyes could have been light reflecting in the dark, the strange gait nothing more than an injured creature dragging itself along. But McDaniel's description was remarkably detailed. He wasn't vague. He insisted the creature had 3 legs, 2 small arms, a short grayish body, and those eyes like red flashlights. It was an oddly specific picture, not the fuzzy impression of a startled man. Then there was the kangaroo theory. At first it seemed laughable, but some locals, and even a few officers considered it seriously. The odd spacing of the tracks, the bounding leaps, and the 3-toed impressions vaguely resembled kangaroo prints. Perhaps one had escaped from a circus or a private collection, they reasoned. The idea wasn't impossible. After all, exotic animals sometimes turn up in unexpected places. But no circuses or zoos reported a missing kangaroo, and no owners came forward to claim responsibility. More importantly, kangaroos don't scratch at people's houses in the middle of the night, and none of them have glowing red eyes. Others try to reduce the whole affair to hysteria. According to this view, McDaniel's frightening sighting triggered a chain reaction of fear in the small community. Once his description hit the newspapers, everyone in Enfield began seeing things that weren't really there. A child hearing an owl screech at night imagined it was the horror. Farmers who noticed restless livestock assumed the creature was prowling. Strange shadows became monsters, and imagination filled in the rest. Mass hysteria has a history of producing convincing stories, from phantom attackers to UFO waves. Perhaps the Enfield Horror was just another example. But hysteria doesn't explain claw marks on siding, or the tracks pressed deep into wet earth. Residents and police alike saw those impressions, 3-toed and 6 inches wide, spaced far apart as if made by enormous leaps. They weren't vague shadows, they were physical marks. Skeptics countered that pranksters could have faked them, perhaps by carving wooden molds and pressing them into the mud. But if it was a hoax, it required a great deal of effort, coordination, and secrecy. No one admitted responsibility, and no one gained anything from it. Another skeptical explanation leaned on psychology. McDaniel, they argued, may have been sincere but mistaken. When adrenaline spikes, the human mind can distort perception. A strange animal glimpsed in poor light can grow into a monster in memory. Details harden, exaggerations feel real, and fear reinforces conviction. Under this theory, McDaniel believed everything he said, but his brain had twisted the ordinary into the extraordinary. Yet even that didn't account for the consistency of his description, or the way neighbors independently reported similar sounds and shapes. Were they all suffering from the same tricks of the mind? Even local officials walked a careful line. Publicly, they leaned toward rational explanations. Privately, some admitted they had no answers. A few officers had seen the tracks themselves and found them deeply unsettling. They couldn't deny what was in front of them, but neither did they want to admit the possibility of something truly unexplained roaming their town. To suggest otherwise risked ridicule, and yet the unease never left them. The skepticism spread beyond Enfield, with journalists and scientists chiming in. Articles mocked the town as gullible, suggesting the people of Enfield had let their imaginations run wild. But the ridicule didn't erase the testimony of McDaniel, nor the evidence many had seen with their own eyes. For every article that laughed, another treated the story with seriousness, keeping the debate alive. The divide grew sharper. Believers saw the horror as proof that the world still held mysteries beyond modern science. Skeptics insisted it was a mixture of error, fear, and exaggeration. But whether they believed or doubted, one fact lingered: Enfield had changed. Even those who dismissed the story locked their doors at night. And when strange cries echoed across the fields, even skeptics paused, listening more closely than they cared to admit. Because doubt is easy in the daylight, but in the quiet darkness of rural Illinois, when the sounds of the night creep in and the memory of glowing eyes returns, certainty is much harder to hold on to. By early May of 1973, the story of the Enfield Horror had spread far beyond the borders of the quiet Illinois town. What began as one man's unnerving testimony had transformed into headlines, radio discussions, and late-night news segments. Reporters from Chicago and St. Louis poured into Enfield, eager to interview witnesses, photograph the sites of the encounters, and capture the strange atmosphere that had taken hold of the community. Henry McDaniel quickly found himself at the center of the storm. Reporters crowded his front yard, peppering him with questions. They wanted him to retell every detail of his encounter, and each time he did, his account remained strikingly consistent. The glowing red eyes, the leathery skin, the 3 legs, and the way the creature bounded away into the night. He wasn't a showman, and he didn't embellish. His calm, matter-of-fact delivery only made the story more chilling. But with publicity came scrutiny. Newspapers were divided in tone. Some treated the story with a sense of awe, reporting the details as though the creature might still be prowling the cornfields. Others mocked it, reducing the Enfield Horror to nothing more than small-town hysteria. Editorials joked about monsters in the bean fields, and questioned how anyone could take such a story seriously in the modern age. For the residents of Enfield, the media attention was both exciting and unwelcome. On one hand, their quiet town had suddenly become the focus of national interest. On the other, they were being portrayed as backward or gullible. Locals bristled at the idea that outsiders considered them foolish. After all, it wasn't just Henry McDaniel's story anymore. Multiple families had reported noises, tracks, and fleeting glimpses of something unusual. To dismiss them all as liars or dreamers felt insulting. The attention drew more than just reporters. Amateur investigators, self-proclaimed monster hunters, and curious thrill-seekers began arriving nightly, They crowded country roads with their cars, shined flashlights into fields, and carried rifles in hopes of catching the creature. Some treated it like entertainment, but for Enfield's residents, it was unnerving to see strangers tramping through their land, armed and restless. McDaniel, though cooperative, grew weary of the spotlight. He hadn't asked for attention. He had simply reported what he saw. Yet the more he spoke, the more the story grew. Each retelling invited new theories, new questions, and more outsiders. For a man who valued his reputation, the unwanted fame became another burden. Still, he never wavered. "I know what I saw," he told one persistent journalist. "If people want to laugh, let them laugh. But I won't change my story." His unwavering stance kept the story alive, giving it legitimacy even in the face of ridicule. The media storm also created a divide in Enfield itself. Some townsfolk were proud that their little community had made headlines, even if the story was strange. Others were embarrassed, worried that the town would forever be associated with monsters and hysteria. For a place that had always lived quietly in the background, the sudden glare of publicity was deeply uncomfortable. Meanwhile, the creature itself seemed to vanish as suddenly as it had appeared. After the first rush of sightings, reports dwindled. A few claimed to hear strange noises in the nights that followed, but there were no more dramatic encounters like McDaniel's. Some argued this proved it had been a fluke all along. Others believed the horror had moved on, retreating back into whatever shadowed corner it had come from. But even in absence, the legend grew. The press coverage had done its work. The name Enfield Horror stuck, etched into articles, radio broadcasts, and the memories of everyone who read about it. For believers, it was proof that the unexplained could erupt in the most ordinary of places. For skeptics, it was an amusing example of small-town imagination. But for Enfield, it became part of their history, whether they liked it or not. The media eventually moved on, chasing the next sensational story. The reporters packed up, the thrill-seekers drifted away, and the headlines faded. Yet the mark left on Enfield remained. Even decades later, the case would resurface in books about cryptids, television documentaries, and online discussions. The storm had passed, but the legend was permanent. The publicity surrounding the Enfield Horror eventually drew in more than journalists and thrill-seekers. It attracted investigators, people determined to dig deeper into the mystery, either to prove it real or to expose it as a mistake. Among them were cryptozoologists, UFO researchers, and paranormal enthusiasts who saw Enfield as a potential hotspot of unexplained activity. One of the most notable groups to arrive was from the nearby town of Mount Vernon. They consisted of amateur monster hunters who had heard about the story on the radio and decided to test their luck. Armed with tape recorders, cameras, and notebooks, they scoured the fields at night, hoping to document something. While they didn't capture the creature itself, they did record strange noises, high-pitched screeches, and unsettling cries that sounded mechanical yet animal all at once. These recordings later circulated among enthusiasts, fueling speculation that the sounds were connected to the horror. Skeptics dismissed them as owls or foxes, but believers argued the tones were too unnatural. Cryptozoologists, who dedicate their lives to studying creatures not recognized by mainstream science, proposed that the Enfield Horror might be a previously undiscovered species. Its strange three-legged gait, they suggested, could be a mutation or an evolutionary adaptation. Perhaps it was an animal displaced from its natural habitat, hiding in the wooded edges of Illinois. Yet no physical evidence beyond tracks was ever found. No hair samples, no scat, no carcass. The absence of biological proof made the scientific explanation weak. UFO researchers took a different approach. To them, the horror's strange appearance and sudden vanishing fit perfectly with theories of extraterrestrials. They noted that reports of glowing eyes and bounding movements were often linked to alien encounters. Some even speculated that the creature might not have been an alien itself, but something released or stranded by a UFO. Interestingly, a few residents of southern Illinois claimed to see strange lights in the sky around the same time, though these reports were scattered and never confirmed. Another camp suggested interdimensional theories. According to this view, the horror was not an alien or an animal at all, but something that slipped through a gap between worlds. Its odd movements, bizarre physiology, and unexplained disappearance all supported the idea of a creature not fully tethered to our reality. To believers in the paranormal, this explanation made sense. To skeptics, it was fantasy layered over hysteria. Law enforcement officers who revisited the case years later had their own opinions. Most leaned toward the idea that McDaniel and others had encountered a known animal in abnormal circumstances. Some thought of an ape escaped from a private owner. Others suggested a large bird misidentified in the dark. None, however, could explain the tracks with confidence. They admitted the prints were unusual, but preferred to chalk them up to hoaxes rather than entertain stranger ideas. The sheer variety of theories demonstrated one thing. The Enfield Horror defied easy classification. It was too strange to fit the mold of an ordinary animal, yet lacked the evidence to be accepted as something truly unknown. Each theory explained part of the puzzle, but left other pieces missing. And the longer time went on without new sightings, the harder it became to pin the creature down. Still, the investigators left their mark. Their notebooks, recordings, and interviews preserved the details of the case, ensuring that it would not be forgotten. Without them, the Enfield Horror might have faded into nothing more than a small-town rumor. Instead, it became part of a larger conversation about cryptids, UFOs, and the boundaries of human understanding. For Enfield itself, the arrival of outsiders was a mixed blessing. On one hand, it brought excitement and a strange kind of fame. On the other, it disrupted the quiet life of the town and left residents feeling as though they were exhibits in someone else's spectacle. Yet whether they liked it or not, their town had been marked, the creature had passed through, and the world had noticed. By late spring of 1973, the Enfield Horror slipped away as abruptly as it had arrived. For weeks the town had lived in a haze of fear, fascination, and speculation. Patrols combed the fields at night, newspapers chased fresh headlines, and families huddled indoors listening for the creature's screeches. Then, just as quickly, the noise died down. The scratching at doors stopped. The strange metallic cries that had once cut through the silence of the night grew less frequent until they ceased altogether, and with their disappearance, so too did the presence of the horror. For skeptics, this fading was all the evidence they needed. If the horror had been real, they argued, there would have been more sightings, more tracks, or even a body. Its silence proved it had never existed at all. They saw the Enfield affair as a small-town scare, an ember fanned into flame by imagination, and then extinguished when people simply grew tired of the story. McDaniel, they said, must have been mistaken that night. Perhaps he saw an animal in poor light, its details distorted by fear. Perhaps the tracks were hoaxes pressed into the soil by pranksters, and once the frenzy ran its course, all that remained was embarrassment. But for believers, the disappearance was the most unsettling chapter. After all, ordinary animals do not appear and vanish in such a way. A hoax can be revealed, a known species identified, but something that retreats into silence without leaving a trace is far more haunting. If the Enfield Horror was real, then where did it go? Did it vanish deeper into the backwoods of southern Illinois, waiting for attention to fade before it returned? Did it move on to another unsuspecting town, another family startled by scratching at the door? Or was it never fully part of this world at all, slipping back through some invisible boundary that had briefly let it wander into ours? Henry McDaniel never changed his stance. Months later, long after reporters had left and nightly patrols had ended, he repeated his story with the same calm conviction. "I know it was there," he said. "People can laugh if they want, but I saw it with my own eyes." His refusal to waver gave the legend an anchor. Even in the absence of new encounters, his testimony stood firm, frustrating skeptics who hoped time would wear it down. McDaniel was no storyteller seeking fame. He was a man describing what had appeared on his porch, and his certainty kept the story alive. The town itself carried mixed feelings. Some residents welcomed the quiet. They wanted life to return to what it had been before the reporters and monster hunters swarmed their streets. They bristled at the way outsiders had painted them as gullible country folk. For them, the horror had been an unwelcome intrusion, a stain on the reputation of their town. Others, however, felt something strange had been taken from them. For a brief time, Enfield had been at the center of a living mystery. People across the country knew its name. When the horror vanished, it left behind not just silence but a hollow absence, as though a piece of the town's identity had gone with it. The years that followed did not erase the tale. Books on cryptids and paranormal phenomena began to include chapters on the Enfield Horror, placing it alongside better-known creatures like Mothman and the Jersey Devil. Television programs dramatized McDaniel's account, complete with glowing eyes and bounding leaps. Paranormal researchers cited the case as evidence of how the strange could erupt in the most ordinary of places. Online discussions decades later would bring it back again and again, debated by believers and skeptics alike. For Enfield, the legacy was permanent. No matter how much time passed, the town was forever tied to the creature. Some residents grew tired of the association, rolling their eyes whenever the story resurfaced. Others leaned into it, embracing the notoriety, and even joking about their local monster. Yet beneath the humor and the denial, unease lingered. Because whether or not the creature was real, the fear had been real. The claw marks on McDaniel's siding were real. The three-toed tracks pressed into wet dirt were real. And the memory of sleepless nights listening for cries in the fields was real. The Enfield Horror may have disappeared, but its shadow endured. It lingered not in sightings or physical evidence, but in the imagination. The absence itself became part of the legend. A creature that appeared without explanation and vanished without conclusion left only questions in its wake. And perhaps that is why the story has lasted for decades. Mysteries with answers fade. Mysteries with silence remain. Every legend leaves behind more questions than answers, and the story of the Enfield Horror is no exception. What began as a quiet April night in 1973 became one of the strangest episodes in American cryptid history. A man opened his door to investigate a sound, and was confronted by something he could not explain. 3 legs, glowing eyes, grey skin, and a scream that rattled him to his core. He fired his gun. The creature bounded away, and for weeks afterward, Enfield was never the same. The tracks stamped in the earth, the claw marks on siding, the cries in the dark. These details gave the story a weight that few mysteries carry. They weren't just words whispered in the night. They were physical reminders that something unusual had passed through the town. Neighbors saw the prints. Officers examined them. Families heard the sounds that set dogs barking and livestock trembling. To dismiss it all as imagination feels easy in hindsight, but in the moment, it was terrifyingly real. Skeptics still insist on rational explanations. They argue McDaniel misidentified an animal in poor light, that pranksters faked the tracks, that hysteria magnified every noise and shadow into a monster, and maybe, in pieces, those theories hold weight. But taken together, they leave gaps. They don't explain the consistency of McDaniel's testimony. They don't explain why his neighbors independently reported similar sounds and glimpses. They don't explain the fear that gripped a whole town. Believers point to other possibilities. Perhaps the Enfield Horror was an unknown species, a rare mutation that surfaced briefly and disappeared. Perhaps it was connected to UFO phenomena, another piece of the puzzle linking strange creatures with unexplained lights in the sky. Or perhaps most chilling of all, it was something not meant for this world at all. Something that slipped through a crack in reality, lingered for a short while, and then slipped back out. Henry McDaniel's story remains the anchor of the legend. Through all the ridicule, through the laughter of skeptics and the sensational headlines, he never changed his words. He didn't claim more than he saw. He didn't dress it up to impress. He simply repeated the truth as he knew it. A creature came to his door, and he would never forget it. His calm certainty carried through the years is perhaps why the tale endures. For Enfield, the legacy is a double-edged sword. The town that once prized its quiet normalcy is forever linked to the horror. Some residents wish the story would fade, tired of the attention it brings. Others embrace it, proud to have their own piece of the unexplained stitched into local lore. But whether they believe or deny, the mark remains. The Enfield Horror is part of their history, as permanent as the roads and fields that surround them. And maybe that is the final shadow of the story, the way it lingers, unresolved. The creature appeared, terrified a family, rattled a community, drew the world's attention, and then vanished. It left no body, no proof, only the echo of its presence. That silence is more powerful than any photograph or specimen could ever be, because silence forces us to wonder. The Enfield Horror may never return, but the questions it raised never left. What was it that McDaniel saw? Where did it come from? Where did it go? And perhaps most unsettling of all, could it come back? Until those questions are answered, the horror endures, a creature that defied description and refused to be forgotten. The story of the Enfield Horror begins with a man hearing scratching outside his home, and ends with a mystery that refuses to be explained. In April 1973, Henry McDaniel described a creature unlike anything seen before. Short, grey-skinned, glowing eyes, and moving on 3 legs with leaps that carried it incredible distances. He fired his revolver, heard the bullets strike, and watched it vanish into the darkness. What followed was weeks of panic, tracks pressed deep into the earth, armed search parties, and a media storm that transformed a quiet Illinois town into the center of one of America's strangest mysteries. Skeptics have always argued that McDaniel misidentified an ordinary animal, maybe a dog, a monkey, or even a kangaroo escaped from a private collection. Others say hysteria spread through Enfield, turning shadows and animal cries into proof of a monster. But those theories cannot erase the three-toed tracks officers and neighbors saw for themselves, nor the claw marks on McDaniel's siding, nor the high-pitched cries that many families heard in the night. Even if hysteria played a role, something unusual happened in Enfield, something no one has ever explained away completely. Believers point to stranger possibilities. To them, the Enfield Horror was not just an animal. It was something unknown, maybe even otherworldly. Some link it to UFO reports in southern Illinois around the same time. Others believe it slipped from another dimension, appearing briefly before vanishing again. These explanations may sound far-fetched, but so does the idea of a creature with 3 legs and glowing eyes standing on a man's porch. Through it all, Henry McDaniel never changed his story. He did not seek fame, he did not embellish, and he gained nothing from telling it. Even years later, he repeated the same details with steady conviction. The creature was real, and he saw it. That quiet certainty is what gives the legend its staying power. For Enfield, the legacy was permanent. Some residents rolled their eyes and wished the story would fade. Others embraced the notoriety. But whether they laughed or believed, none of them could deny that the town had been shaken. For a brief time, Enfield was a place where the ordinary cracked open and something unexplainable slipped through. The Enfield Horror may never appear again. Perhaps it left forever, or perhaps it still lingers in the corners of those fields, waiting for another restless night. What makes the story endure is not what we know, but what we don't. Proof is absent, answers are missing, and sometimes it is the silence left behind that keeps a mystery alive.